I cannot hear. Oh, okay. Should we go on mute until we're up?
Yes. And so it looks like we are live now. Welcome. I'm Professor Reiter. I'm an assistant professor of law here at Vermont Law School, and I'm honored to moderate this panel, the Nature-Based Solutions panel, as part of the VJEL Symposium. So as many of you may know already, nature has the potential to save lives and to save money while contributing to both mitigation and adaptation efforts in the fight against climate change. Today, I am joined by thought leaders representing various disciplines spanning various sectors to discuss the viability of using nature-based solutions to tackle climate change. So this afternoon, we will hear from the following and in the following order. Ms. Jennifer Tabola, the Deputy Managing Director of the Global Tackling Climate Change Team at the Nature Conservancy. His Excellency Ambassador Ronny Jumeau from the Republic of the Seychelles. Professor Reed Porter, Senior Staff Attorney from the Marine Affairs Institute at Roger Williams University School of Law. And finally, Dr. Pushpam Kumar, Chief Environmental Economist and Senior Economic Advisor at the United Nations Environment Program. So against my better instincts, the speakers have assured me that referring to them by their first name will be just fine for this panel, and so I will do so going forward. To save as much time as possible for their presentations and the Q&A period at the end, I would like to refer you to the event program where you will find their more detailed bios for your reference. And in terms of our format, we will have 15 minutes per speaker, followed by 10 minutes for question and answer. I believe Antonio has already provided these instructions, but for the members of the audience, kindly submit your questions via the chat function. And if the question is directed to a particular panelist, please indicate as such. I will pose the questions from the audience to the panelists during our Q&A period. All right, so let's go ahead and get started, and we will be starting with Jennifer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you all, and I am inspired by the fact that you are interested in these topics and devoting precious time to learn more. So just by way of quick introduction, I am Jennifer Tabola. I serve as the Deputy Managing Director for the Nature Conservancy's global team working on climate change. And for us, that really means that we are working across a multitude of disciplines. On our team, we have communication and mobilization specialists. We have carbon market finance leaders. We have people working at the international global climate policy level. And we also have people who work on impact investing. I want to make sure that I am seeing if we're on the slides, if you can help me out with that. I'm not seeing them, so I just want to make sure. Are we on slide 1? There we are. Now I can see it. Terrific. So this is obviously ground zero for natural climate solutions. Photosynthesis is the beginning and the end, and really what we kind of talk about is nature's, solutions are hidden in, plain sight. And our organization over the last 10 years has been doing a lot of work to advance the science, but as importantly, the application of that science to really look at where we have potential to drive climate solutions that give us all kinds of co-benefits. And I'll be talking about that in just a moment. Go ahead and advance. By way of just a quick orientation to the Nature Conservancy, I'm sure many of you aren't familiar with our organization, but so you understand the context for our work. We started over 70 years ago. We evolved from our beginnings really as an organization that was rooted in looking at the potential for conservation and making sure that, some of the most important, both biodiverse and also economically important areas were protected. We had volunteers who really realized the ecological and community importance of this location in New York as the watershed for drinking water and a host of other ecosystem services, and came together with science, with a market-based solution, and and basically was able to drive a lasting results commitment to preserving and protecting this watershed. Since then, of course, TNC has expanded significantly, developing new science that helps explain the complexity of natural systems, looking at new approaches to deal with challenges, and new tools for technological innovation. We've also expanded geographically and thematically, obviously consistent with the growing complexity of the challenges that we're facing in our natural environment. Next slide. So just to give you a very quick snapshot of the reach that we have as a global nonprofit, we are active in 79 countries. We have over 400 scientists that serve on our team. And to date, we have protected over 125 million acres globally around the world. Next. And our mission, just to ground us in that, is really twofold. We are, working to essentially make sure that the diversity of life thrives and that people act to conserve nature, both for its own sake and, of course, its ability to fulfill our needs and enrich our lives. Next. But as everybody on this call well knows, and I don't need to go into detail, our planet is, of course, at a crossroads. We know that the choices we are making today will define the legacy that we leave behind for multiple generations. Over the next 30 years, we are looking at global population growing to over 9.7 billion. That means food demand is going to be growing by 50%. Energy demand is growing by 56%. Given those levels of growth, one of the questions that we posed to the Nature Conservancy 7 years ago was, how can humans and nature coexist and thrive given those demands? Our scientists modeled what the world could look like in 30 years under a business as usual scenario and a sustainability pathway. And what we found, which is optimistic, undoubtedly, but that it is possible to create a future where people and nature thrive, but it is going to require that we radically change how we source energy and food in particular. Obviously need to ramp up clean energy. We need to grow more food using less land and water, and we need to end overfishing. And just noting, moving into the area we're focused on today, right now, our business as usual path demonstrates at least a 3 degrees increase in average temperature. And that obviously would result in significant loss of life and economic impact. Next. So what are we doing about honing in on the climate challenge that we have in front of us? What are we doing about that? At the Nature Conservancy, we're advancing 3 strategies to tackle climate change: a low carbon economy with respect to renewable energy and efficiencies, looking at adaptation, of course, and resilience, but I'm going to hone in here on nature-based solutions. Next. So again, with the Conservancy, we always start with science. And in 2017, the Nature Conservancy led a study that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, showing that through natural climate solutions, the land sector has the potential to deliver up to 1/3 of the emission reductions needed by 2030 to hold global warming below 2 degrees cost effectively. So obviously the economics are critical, and the credibility of this science as a foundation for moving natural climate solutions forward has also been a critical factor. Next slide. So what do we mean when we're talking about natural climate solutions? We're talking about protecting, better managing, and restoring forests, wetlands, grasslands, and agricultural lands, what we call within the Conservancy are different pathways to realize natural climate solutions. We know, and you know, of course, that those solutions also deliver a host of ecosystem benefits and progress on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We also know from our science that natural climate solutions can capture up to 11 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by 2030. That is essentially the equivalent of eliminating all the cars on the planet twice over. And while that figure represents 1/3 of the mitigation needed by 2030 to limit warming to under 2 degrees, the remaining 2/3, of course, will need to come from clean energy. Our science also shows that there's a particularly large opportunity to tackle climate change by improving how we manage our lands, but our science also highlights the critical importance of protecting our intact natural lands, as well as restoring those that have been lost. Further, I would say that, and you'll see a little bit further on in the presentation, our scientists are continuously working to refine the numbers you see here and to deepen our understanding of this science. Next slide. I think important to note that while you'll see that the biggest mitigation opportunity is in how we manage our lands, our working lands, so improving forestry, agriculture, grazing, that is critical in terms of where we get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of our cost and in terms of our actual mitigation potential. We always start with protection. That is really the foundation. So if we don't, work to protect the intact landscapes, we know that the damage is going to outweigh everything that we do with respect to managing and restoring lands. So important to think about this, that we're looking, yes, at where the biggest mitigation opportunities are, but we also know that there are irrecoverable stocks of carbon right now, particularly in our tropical forests, but also in our blue carbon, in our wetlands, in our mangroves, et cetera, that if we, don't step in now to protect those, regardless of what we do in the other two quadrants with managing and restoring, we will not get to the under 2 degrees. Next. With respect to what we're doing in taking this science and actually applying it, we are developing now new global data sets and working with those to prioritize which pathways will help us understand both the scale and the distribution of opportunities within countries. These include a new map you're looking at right now that was just published in Nature last week of the potential, for example, of natural forest regrowth. I was just looking at the chat. I'm hoping you're able to hear. So I think, for example, you have probably heard just this week that the administration in the United States signed an executive order involving the federal government and global tree planting initiative. And this has had a lot of private sector interest. And of course, that's important. But the study that just came out demonstrates that we actually, forests are good. If you let them grow, they can regenerate. Obviously, the opportunity cost of that is what is in play. Most places where we can regenerate growth, that we have all other working land uses already in place. So it's a question of where and how can we incentivize degraded lands to come back. Next. So to realize the full potential of natural climate solutions, the Nature Conservancy is working very closely with countries as they develop their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, under the Paris Climate Agreement. While 2/3 of countries' NDCs include references to actions in forest and other ecosystems, we know that right now only 38 out of 160 countries have the science and the ability to quantify those targets for the land sector. According to a UN database, less than 3% of subnational climate commitments relate to land use. And likewise, few countries have plans to harness the full cost-effective potential of NCS to deliver their NDCs. So countries that do have plans need practical support with implementation. And TNC is working with partners to advance the NDCs. I will say, for example, we have teams working in China, Colombia, Indonesia, Canada, that are really looking at the NCS potential for pathways in those countries. And we are working hand in glove with policymakers to make sure that they have the credible science-based information that they need to realize their NCS in their country and to increase their climate ambition. Next. Next slide. So I just want to touch upon for a moment, we're looking, as I said, the most important thing I think to take away here is that we are looking at how to drive science to make sure that it gets on the ground and that it is financed at a scale that is going to matter and to make a difference. So we are really constantly taking the science, applying it, mixing it in with the economics and the policy incentives, and then looking at how we can drive the finance to actually scale what works. And then, of course, monitoring and adapting as we go. Next. So this is just an example of where currently, you can see there's a lot of the globe where we have work left to do, but where we do have country level analyses. And this is what's really going to be able to drive change and mitigation. Until we get it to this level, we don't have countries who are able to really target and make sense of the science enough to figure out how that marries, especially with their economic development goals, and be able to take action. Next. I wanted to just give you 3 quick snapshots before I close of what does this look like in, on the ground, what is happening. So starting closest to home and not too far from where you are now in Vermont, we have a project underway called Blue Ridge to Boreal. This is a 179 million acre region that encompasses the Appalachian Mountains, and it stretches almost 2,000 miles from northern Alabama to Canada. Hopefully some of you have had your feet on this trail. TNC scientists have identified an essential network of lands in this Blue Ridge to Boreal region. And these are disproportionately important for conserving biodiversity as the climate changes. These really are pathways and corridors for species to be able to migrate north as the climate warms. And because of that, TNC is doing a few things. One, we're scaling up land protection through new funding mechanisms, such as a low interest revolving loan fund that will enable us to act quickly to secure high conservation value properties. We are incentivizing small private landowners to adopt NCS practices by enabling them to access carbon markets by pooling their management approaches and also simplifying carbon verification methods. So trying to remove those barriers for individuals to partake in this emerging carbon market. And working with legislators on the policy side to enact supportive policies and public funding. And finally, mobilizing millions of people in the region is a powerful new constituency to advocate for climate action in this biosensitive part of the United States. Next. So we know tropical forests are absolutely critical for natural climate solutions. So looking to Indonesia, in East Kalimantan, TNC is helping to convene governments, business, and that government, I mean both national and subnational business, community institutions, many of whom have conflicting interests, of course, to agree on what we're calling a Green Growth Compact. And this is a strategy, multi-sectoral, to manage forests for environmental and economic health. We have secured a government commitment to protect more than 1 million acres of forest within areas that are slated for palm oil development. And now TNC is also expanding our efforts across East and North Kalimantan provinces, working to broker agreements among government agencies, companies, NGOs, and communities to expand existing initiatives and to implement new ones, such as the protection and restoration of peatland. This is really an urgent opportunity to balance tropical forest conservation with economic growth while addressing underlying issues that we know are there, with land use and development planning, very weak tenure rights for local communities, and of course, vulnerability to fire. All of these, which are drivers of carbon emissions in Indonesia and globally. And some of you may have just seen the news about the new omnibus job creation bill that has come out of Indonesia, which is threatening a lot of the work I just talked about. And so as Indonesia pushes, for more economic development and partners, for example, more closely with China, they are, looking to reverse and lower, the barrier for development. So we have new threats as of literally this week on the horizon there. And lastly, I just want to touch on the Amazon forest and then close, just so you see, what is this really looking like? What does this mean when we marry mobilization, science, policy, finance, and local communities to try to advance our work here? So deforestation in the Amazon obviously has been surging. Right now, the estimates are that we are destroying about a square mile every hour of every day. Scientists are increasingly worried that we're nearing a tipping point. If we lose another 15% of the Amazon, the hydrology of the forest may shift. We know that would irreversibly change as much as half of the rainforest into a fire-prone savanna. And this would cause really unaccountable extinctions, irreparable harm for the indigenous cultures who are deeply connected to the forest, and cause one of the largest releases of greenhouse gases in history, essentially up to the equivalent of 2 years of global emissions. So what are we doing? In Brazil and Colombia, TNC is working closely with our indigenous allies to improve management and protection across millions of acres. We're focusing in particular on stopping the expansion of the agricultural frontier. We're trying to help intensify agriculture so that we can still meet the food and economic demands, but without going further into the Amazon. And we're really working to address the root cause of deforestation by working with smallholder farmers and ranchers who are responsible for approximately 30% of the deforestation in the Amazon, to restore forest and to also improve their livelihoods by growing cacao, which is a far more profitable and sustainable endeavor than cattle ranching. So I want to make sure that we'll leave some time for questions, but I hope that gives you at least a snapshot of how the science travels all the way from, where we have scientists on the ground to, the journals, to, the published science, to policy, mixed with the economic assessment, and then, driving real change on the ground.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that excellent presentation, knowing the interdisciplinary work that the Nature Conservancy does. And so now that we've checked out what's going on in forests all over the world, I think we're going to head to the Seychelles and learn a little bit more about what the Seychelles has been doing with nature-based solutions in the ocean space. So Ronny, you're next. Ronny, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so although the introductory notes say that I'm Seychelles Ambassador to the United Nations, and I'm speaking to you from New York right now, I'm going to speak to you as another hat that I wear as Seychelles Ambassador at Large, or roving ambassador for the ocean, for climate change, and for sustainable development issues. And I'm going to talk about how a small island developing state, a SIDS, is increasing its contribution to the global fight against climate change severalfold by acting as a large ocean state. May I say, referring to our first speaker, Jennifer, Seychelles, a lot of what I'm saying here has been done in partnership actually with the Nature Conservancy. And I refer to TNC as I go along. So we're one of the smallest partners in terms of countries, but one of the most active and productive partners of TNC. So as a large ocean state, Seychelles looks to the ocean, the blue economy, and sustainable development goal, life underwater, as gateways to implement the other SDGs, the 2030 Agenda, and the Paris Agreement. But that does not mean that we're overlooking SDG 15, which is life on land, and which is what Jennifer addressed a lot about in her presentation. Because when it comes to SDG 15, Seychelles has for many years now, we've protected 48% of the little land that we have, and which is one of the highest proportions of protected land in any country in the world. And we are looking to protect even more by the end of the year. Our target actually is to protect 50% of the little land we have. Now, the two most important pillars of the Seychelles economy are marine-based tourism, which is number one, but which collapsed with COVID-19, as we know what happened to tourism around the world, and fisheries. And both of them, number one and number two, depend on a healthy ocean. Yet, despite the pandemic and the economic pressures it put us under and the collapse of tourism, Seychelles in March this year, we finalized our first marine spatial plan, and with it, the protection of 30% of our exclusive economic zone. Next slide, please. Okay. Seychelles is one of the few countries in the world to have a marine spatial plan for its entire maritime space, which for us is 1.35 million square kilometers. That is 3,000 times, and you see in the following slide, the map of the EZ, that is, our marine space is 3,000 times bigger than all our islands put together. As it says over here, all our islands, we have 115 islands, which total 455 square kilometers. It's about 176 square miles, tiny. And the 115 islands put together make up a mere 0.03% of our combined land and marine territory. So when you factor in our EZ, we're actually a liquid country. Now, as recently as 2018, Seychelles, despite protecting nearly 50% of the islands, had protected only 0.04% of our ocean. And even then, that 0.04% of our ocean was bigger than all the islands put together. So that gives you an idea of how huge, how gigantic our EEZ is. And it's larger than Kenya, neighboring Kenya on the East African coast. It's larger than Tanzania. It's larger than Madagascar, as we see in the next slide. So next slide, please. This is my favorite map of Seychelles. Now, the green areas, the dark green and light areas, that totals 30% of our territory, of the territory that has been protected. So these are all the protected areas. Now, of that, half of it, 15% of this entire blue area has been protected fully. We call that our high biodiversity areas. That is mainly in the bottom southwest of the territory. And that alone is 410,000 square kilometers or 158,000 square miles. So all in all, Seychelles has already in 2020 tripled the SDG 14 and the CBD Aichi targets on ocean protection. Together, all the green areas are larger than Germany. They are larger than Japan. And don't forget, we're talking of a population of only 98,000 people here. Now, if we look at this map, if you go to the top of the top arc of the EZ, where it says Seychelles Exclusive Economic Zone, and you run a line to the west, and you can see part of East Africa there, our EZ, if we're going to go down the East African coast, starts in Somalia. And if you drop down to the bottommost part of the EZ, which is next to Madagascar, that part would be equivalent to being in Mozambique. So from north to south, our EZ runs from southern Somalia, through Kenya, through Tanzania, into northern Mozambique, an equivalent, for example. And you can see its width is even larger than that. Another thing I'd like to point out here, the main fully protected area, the 15%, you can see in the bottom southwest corner. But even in the light green area at the top, you can see the areas of dark green. And this shows the complexity of the work we're doing with nature-based solutions and ocean protection. If you go to the northeast corner, the top corner of the map, what it shows there are two privately owned resort islands who have taken different approaches to both nature-based solutions and to ocean protection. One of them is called Bird Island, which has millions of seabirds come to live, and also the world's heaviest giant tortoise is over there. And Bird Island chose to fully protect the areas around it. You can see the dark green bit. The island next to it, these, by the way, are our two most northernmost islands in Seychelles. The other island next to it, Dennis Island, is another resort island, another hotel island, but which one of its attractions, for example, is sport fishing, game fishing. So it decided not to go for full protection. And so this is all the negotiations that we had to do as we were choosing under the Marine Spatial Plan which areas to protect. To the just left of center at the top, you can see part of that green, light green area, the dark green areas. One of them, so we just talk of 2 privately owned islands. One of them, which is the Daros Island, is another privately owned island run by an international NGO, Save Our Oceans, and they requested full protection under the Seychelles Marine Protected Areas. So what you're seeing here is a different territories, but the total you can see, it's now, as you can see, the islands are mere dots. So if we were to limit our nature-based solutions to our islands, as compared to what you're seeing here, you can see that our contribution to fighting climate change would be much less smaller than they are now. So next slide, please. Now, how are we financing the work we're doing? The protection of 30% of our ocean territory and the nature-based solutions. So Seychelles, we are a high-income country. And because of that, we don't have access to concessional financing, obviously not to ODA or overseas development assistance in grant. We have to take loans. So what Seychelles did is we pioneered 2 innovative financing mechanisms. We call that our Blue Finance, to fund our Marine Spatial Plan, the marine protected areas, ocean climate action, and our transition to a more sustainable fishing, which adds to the resilience of the oceans. The first of those Blue Finance mechanisms is a first of its kind $22 million debt swap for ocean conservation, ocean sustainability, and ocean climate action. The debt swap, which was with the Paris Club in South Africa, and the financial and technical support of the Nature Conservancy, more precisely its impact investment arm, NatureVest, was a 2012 Rio +20 commitment. When we protected in Rio, when we promised in Rio that we would protect 30% of Seychelles EEZ by 2020. We're extremely proud that we've met this pledge. I don't know how many of the hundreds of commitments made at Rio +20 have actually been realized, but at least we delivered on this one. The second Blue Finance, innovative financing mechanism that we did is the world's first sovereign blue bond. Now everybody's talking about blue bonds and green bonds and that sort of thing. But we were the first to do a blue bond worth $15 million. It's to transition Seychelles' domestic and artisanal fishery to more sustainable practices while strengthening ocean resilience. Next slide, please. Over there. There we are. So this shows more details about the blue bond and the debt swap. So the blue bond offers blue loans to the fisheries private sector. It's guaranteed by the Seychelles government, but the money was raised for the private sector so that they can borrow at better rates than commercial banks. In Seychelles, if you're going to invest in tourism, easy to get a loan from the banks and good terms. You tell the commercial banks you want to invest in fisheries, they think the risks are too high and too iffy, so it's a much more difficult deal. But one condition, because the investors, private sector investors in fisheries will come to the blue bond, it allows us to put certain conditions as to sustainability. And one of the conditions is that the borrowers must incorporate sustainable methods that ease the stress on fish stock, including by diversifying existing practices and offering more sustainable livelihoods. For example, domestic private investors are reportedly looking to the blue loans to venture into Seychelles' first aquaculture or mariculture farms. These will help ease growing pressures of overfishing by providing alternative sources of seafood and jobs. Next slide, please. This is about SEICAT. Now, SEICAT, the proceeds of the debt swap And the grant proportion of the blue bond is $15 million, $13 million to be lent out by the Development Bank of Seychelles, and $12 million to be lent out, $3 million are in grants. So the proceeds of the debt swap, the $22 million debt swap, plus $3 million from the blue bond, they are managed by an independent Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust known as SECAT. Since 2017, SECAT has disbursed some $1.5 million to Seychelles for ocean conservation and climate action and blue economy activities. $1.5 million is not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but we're talking of $1.5 million in grants to a population of 98,000 people. So when you take out the inactive, economically inactive proportion of the population, that's a lot of money. And right now, SECAT is offering to Seychelles stakeholders $700,000 in grants every year. That for us is a big game changer when it comes to financing NBS, nature-based solutions, and ocean climate action. And SECAT assesses every one of the projects for its environment and social impacts. As you can see on this slide, of the 33 projects funded so far, 94% are community-led, 55% are by women, 42% are youth-led. Apart from SDG 14 itself, the 33 projects address 10 of the 17 SDGs. I told you we are using SDG 14 as a gateway to the other SDGs. And 36% of the grants are aimed at SDG target 8.4 to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Next slide, please. So how do we turn our protected areas into nature-based solutions to climate change, to environmental degradation, and to overfishing? Seychelles is one of the most forested countries in the world. However, the smallness of our islands means that our forests make a negligible contribution to addressing climate change. Fortunately, for when you flip to us being a large ocean state, in 2013, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, recognized the potential of 3 coastal and marine ecosystems to sequester and store carbon. These are seagrass, mangroves, and salt marshes, which sequester and store more carbon per unit area than terrestrial forests. The IPCC identified accounting methodologies for 3 of the ecosystems. If we could go to the next slide, please. Yes, so 3 of those ecosystems, that's seagrass, mangroves, and salt marshes, for their mitigation value, allowing countries to include them in their national accounting inventories. So with that finding by IPCC, islands which are large ocean states can now contribute to climate action way beyond the small size of their land territories. So can we go to the next slide, please? So what Seychelles is going to do? We just talked about NDCs, Jennifer talked about NDCs. Seychelles will incorporate its blue carbon ecosystems in our revised and updated NDC, which is the nationally determined contribution, the official name for climate pledges under the Paris Agreement, as nature-based solutions. Our NDC will have a blue or ocean chapter, which will include such blue carbon habitats as mangroves and seagrass beds or meadows for both their mitigation and their adaptation values. Next slide, please. We will map these habitats. We will measure how much carbon they store, and we will design effective management plans. The mapping will most probably discover blue carbon habitats outside the protected areas, outside the 30% that's being protected so far. but we will decide about their protection later, as we are now focusing on implementing, managing, funding the existing protected areas we have. At COP25 in Madrid last year, the COP requested the chair of SBSTA, which is the UN Climate Convention's subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, to convene a dialogue this past June on the ocean and climate change to consider how to strengthen mitigation and adaptation. However, SBSTA had to postpone the discussion to later this year, to November, end of November, because of COVID-19. The convention's Standing Committee on Finance also had to postpone a forum on financing nature-based solutions, but Seychelles will be active in both. Next slide, please. Now, the integration of seagrass and mangroves in our revised NDC is not the only NBS initiatives in Seychelles. We have, since 2014, been implementing a $6.5 million Ridge to Reef watershed, upland watershed, mountain watershed, and wetlands project funded by the Adaptation Fund under the Climate Change Convention, which is just one of several terrestrial and coastal EBA initiatives in recent years. Well, as
Ambassador
I just said,
Jumeau?
the IPCC, yes?
We will have to move on to Professor Porter now, Reed. I think we will have time to talk about this in our discussion, though. Okay. So thank you for the great presentation on the Seychelles and what it means to be a big ocean state. And now we're going to dive a little deeper into one of those particular habitats that Ambassador Jumeau referenced, which is salt marshes. And Reed is going to bring us a little closer to home with that habitat and talking about some of the legal implications.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Reed Porter, and I'm just gonna try and bring up my slides. Emily, I don't see that I can share my window for some reason right now, so if you could handle that for me, I would appreciate it. So I'm the Senior Staff Attorney at the Marine Affairs Institute at Roger Williams University School of Law and the Rhode Island Sea Grant Legal Program. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the mystery of sort of why are blue carbon projects not happening at scale so far. One reason for that may be that there's a tension between legal mandates governing public lands management and carbon market standards. Next slide. I do want to mention that the Marine Affairs Institute is based in Bristol, Rhode Island. As you can see in this picture, we're very much an ocean-facing campus, and as part of that, we are home of the Rhode Island Sea Grant Legal Program, which is the only such program in the Northeast. We support informed decision-making by regional coastal stakeholders by providing applied legal research and analysis, but we're not advocates, so we don't represent anyone. And we are a partnership also with URI. Next slide, please. I run the Sea Grant Law Fellow Program, and that actually gives students the opportunities to do some of this work. Next slide, please. And this project is built on a Law Fellow project that we completed earlier, I guess it was last year. Cody Catter and Corey Lee were really big parts of this study that we accomplished in partnership with Restore America's Estuaries. This report is complete and is out in public. Here is a link, and there's another link on the last slide of my talk. And I'd like to thank both Restore America's Estuaries and NOAA for the funding for that work. Next slide, please. Before I get into sort of the details on my study, I want to note that I'm building this on the study that we did on what some of the key legal challenges are to public lands blue carbon projects. But this particular talk and my views are not those of the institute that I work for, or Ray, or NOAA, or anyone else. This is also not legal advice, which I hope that you guys know. And I'm going to be talking sort of generally. So blue carbon projects, like any carbon offset project, are intensely site specific, and it's hard to map across them, but I'm gonna do the best that I can here. Next slide, please. So why is blue carbon important? We know that coastal wetlands come in a variety of forms, from seagrass meadows to salt marshes to mangrove forests, and they have a number of benefits, no matter what form they take. Those can be flood protection, fisheries habitat for nursery habitat for fish stocks. They can enhance water quality by filtering stormwater. And they're also very important carbon sinks. Up to 40% of the soil in a salt marsh can be organic carbon. And they can also be important sources of methane if they're dewatered or desalinized. They're threatened by a number of forces, and those include threats from the sea, like sea level rise, erosion, and by land-based threats like development filling in or encroaching on the places where those salt marshes, for example, might migrate inland. And there's an important challenge here too, in that most coastal wetlands are owned by and managed by public lands management agencies. This is true in the U.S. certainly, but it's also true, I think, on a more global basis, in so much as many coastal wetlands are on submerged lands that are under the control of a sovereign entity. These entities generally or often lack sufficient government funding to protect and restore the wetlands that exist today, and to ensure that they will persist into the future. So blue carbon, by providing an alternative funding stream, can help conserve and restore these coastal wetlands in order to sort of maintain those carbon sinks, enhance carbon mitigation, but also provide all of those other benefits into the future. Next slide, please. So what is blue carbon? I'm talking here about a blue carbon offset, which is a type of a carbon offset. And carbon offsets themselves are a type of payment for ecosystem services. And the idea here is that by paying someone else to absorb or avoid the release of carbon dioxide emissions, the purchaser of a carbon offset can compensate for or offset their own emissions. And the important thing to realize here is there's generally a funding partner who provides the economic funding, and there is a land owner who does the offsetting of emissions. Blue carbon is a form of carbon offset that's specifically focused on ocean and wetland issues. And I'm speaking specifically here about coastal wetlands issues. As I mentioned, many of those areas are owned by or managed by governments. And yet, and those governments are generally interested in, as Ambassador Jumeau just mentioned, interested in preserving these important resources. And yet there are few global and no US examples of consummated blue carbon offset projects. And why is that? Next slide, please. In order to be sold on a carbon market, whether it's a voluntary or a compliance market, and compliance just means you're required to offset your emissions, regardless of the type of market, you need to follow the standards to be traded on that market. And in order to meet those standards, all projects are going to have to demonstrate that their benefits meet some core foundational requirements. And those mean that the benefits have to be real. You have to be providing some carbon benefit, and it has to be additional, more than business as usual. Those benefits have to be permanent, and that usually involves a 100-year timescale. That the benefits that you're promising today will still be accruing in that 100-year period. The benefits have to be verified by a third party through monitoring often, as well as auditing, and they have to be unambiguously owned by whoever is selling those offsets. These sort of foundational principles are going to be in tension with some of the legal mandates that governments have. And if you could go to the next slide, please. Our prior work on this with Restore America's Estuaries focused on identifying some of those legal challenges for blue carbon projects on public wetlands. And this was focused on the US, but many of these challenges I suspect will be common across the globe. We divided those challenges into a couple of different buckets. One is challenges with changing title and property rights at the shoreline. And those are common to any sort of landowner at the shoreline. Over time, property boundaries will change and shift. The category of challenge that I'm going to talk more about today is challenges with the legal authority that land management agencies may have to do these projects. And generally, they have an ability to conduct blue carbon projects, but some of the aspects of making these projects available on the market may be problematic. And in particular, can the agency transfer carbon rights from public lands to a non-public entity? And can they contract in time long enough for permanence requirements? Next slide, please. So, as an example of what these tensions between legal challenges and carbon market standards are, let's look at transfers of carbon rights. So the funding partner who's paying for a project will need to show that they unambiguously own the carbon rights that they're claiming. In order to do that, the public landowner will have to relinquish those rights. That is a form of property right. And in many cases, public lands management agencies that have a conservation focus, such as the National Park Service in the US, may be prohibited from transferring property rights on National Park Service lands to a private entity. And there are very good reasons for this. We do not want, in general, our conservation land managers to be selling national parks in this country. So the legal basis for that is the National Park Service Organic Act, which explicitly authorizes only a very small array of transfers, such as the right to cut timber that has been destroyed by an invasive pest or disease. And blue carbon, as you might expect, is not on that list, right? A second category of problem that may arise in these projects is contracting. So in order to demonstrate permanence over a 100-year period, you will need to show that there's a commitment to monitor and maintain the site. Federal agencies cannot obligate funding beyond the current fiscal year, according to the Anti-Deficiency Act, and many state and federal and tribal laws limit the term of leases to less than a permanence period. So even if a site could be transferred in sort of the leasehold, they wouldn't be able to transfer it for the full permanence period. So for example, the Tulalip tribes constitution or code, restricts leases of tribal land to 70 years. And that's about as long as a lease that it's available, although it may be renewable. So are there ways to get around these tensions? Next slide, please. In practice, the few carbon offset projects on public lands that have been consummated have been extremely complicated. And on the screen, you can see a schematic that just shows the relationships between the different entities involved in a single afforestation project in the Tensas River National Wildlife Refuge. And this included a funding partner, carbonfund.org, was able to claim the carbon rights under a memorandum with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Monitoring was provided by Environmental Synergy. The land itself was actually off Fish and Wildlife Service lands held by the Trust for Public Land, and funding was provided by energy companies like Entergy and DTE. So this was a very complicated project, and this really is typical of how these projects have been so far, and this explains in part why they're so rare. It's quite a lot of work. So next slide, please. Is there a way for carbon market standards to actually help us make these projects easier? In the prior experience that we've seen, the success of these offset projects has been determined by whether the certification standards entities have been willing to accept general government conservation commitments. So if an agency has a general commitment or a statutory duty to conserve public lands, is that sufficient to show that those lands will be permanently protected? If they enter into a memorandum of agreement not to claim carbon rights, is that a sufficient property right that the carbon market would accept? Is a renewable lease or contract sufficient for permanence, for example? And in the project that I just showed, the answer to that was yes. But it's a little bit hard to know in advance what might or might not be accepted. Next slide, please. So I would argue that there's a need for some consistent, transparent guidance on part of the standards entities to address how public lands projects may be able to proceed in the future. And there's a choice here between very liberal approaches to government commitments and stricter approaches. If a liberal approach is taken, that would really expand the universe of potential projects, but that comes with some risk of leakage or other types of failures of those projects, that you may be selling offsets that are not backed by real greenhouse gas mitigation. After all, public policy today and public policy in 100 years are really unlikely to be very closely related. Conversely, strict approaches to government commitments may avoid risks associated with changes in government policy, but on the other hand, you'll get a lot fewer or substantially fewer projects. Next slide, please. So I'm going to suggest that we need some sort of a consistent global framework that works not just for public lands in the US, like the National Park Service, but also accounts for the full range of different national and subnational regulatory approaches to public lands management across the globe. We need those frameworks to be legally enforceable and include project and site-specific commitments. And some of the quasi-governmental foundations that are relatively common can allow us to ensure that monitoring and maintenance of particular sites are sort of legally binding and enforceable. And then we need to allow for lease renewability, provided that that's a matter of right, as long as carbon mitigation conditions are satisfied. Next slide, please. So with that, this is my last slide. Thank you for your attention. The report that we completed previously is available on the Restore America's Estuaries website, and the link is here. And there's a webinar if you're more interested in what are the legal requirements for blue carbon or challenges for blue carbon projects on public lands. You can look at that webinar there, and it's much longer and more detailed. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Reed. So now we've covered some of the fostering and enabling conditions for nature-based solutions like innovative financing, but also some of the constraints associated with the legal structures that may be faced. And now we will head to Dr. Kumar, who's going to talk with us as our economist on this panel in terms of exactly what is it that we're talking about with nature-based solutions and the ecosystem services that they provide, and the rigor with which we can apply these at the project level.
Thank you, Sarah. No need for the slides. Wait, please. So, Sarah, how much time do I have?
You have about, if we want, yes, we can hear you. If we want about 10 minutes for discussion, you have 5, but I'd like to give you 7 at least, and then we can chat for a little bit.
So generous of you. So in that case, I will prefer not to use any slides. And after this very rich discussion from all of you, by the way, my name is Pushpam Kumar. I'm Chief Environmental Economist with United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, based in East Africa, Kenya, Nairobi, very close, not very close, from the great country of Ambassador Ronny, Seychelles. My task is slightly easier. A lot of stuff has been said so far about nature-based solutions. There are definitional issues, there are operational issues, but the most important, decision makers, policy makers want to understand what is economics behind it. Nobody is going to accept nature-based solution, whether it is for climate or enhancing ecosystem services, that somebody is saying, some NGOs, some advocacy group, or some research think tank or university department talking about it. They would like to see in terms of cost effectiveness of intervention or actions under nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions have been there in practice, as you have seen from different presentations and initiatives. Last year, in General Assembly of United Nations in New York, as you know, every year, and many of you are from the law background and international conventions, every year, head of states from all 196, 197 countries, they meet to discuss the challenges and priorities for the global community, including US, including China, including everybody, including Pope or some of the religious leaders. They all come there. And last year, there was a special session on nature-based solution. That shows that politicians, the decision makers, are giving a lot more attention to it, which is a very good thing. Economics fraternity is somehow welcoming, but they want to understand more about it. They want to gather more evidence whether nature-based solution has double dividend benefits. Double dividend means, on the one hand, it addresses the issues of climate or biodiversity, and on the other, it also enhances the flow of ecosystem services. NBS has been talked in the two contexts by and large. One is climate change, of course. The second is pollination benefits or restoration benefits for forest, for wetland, for coast, in some cases wetlands. So these are the broad contours of nature-based solutions. As far as economics is concerned, there are some examples, but it will be hard to come out with a sweeping statement that it has all the merits without having some elements of trade-offs. For example, forest, having more and more forests, having restored forests under social forestry or horticulture or whatever scheme, we can't say that it yields benefits all the time. After a certain stage of forest, for most of the forest types, it stops storing or parking carbon. So that we have to be clear. Second, there are lots of issues in valuations. When we commissioned, the UN commissioned a study to understand the valuations of ecosystem services, I was coordinating one of the major initiatives many of you might have heard called TU, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity. And we found that valuations of ecosystem services, except forest and wetland, there are not much independent evidence to suggest that a scheme under NBS essentially yields net benefits. So that has to be kept in mind. Of course, there are problems of valuations in terms of dimension, unit scale, estate. Those issues are there. And frankly, valuation, if you see the history of valuation since 1886, when Swedish park was valued for public fiscal policy, since then, I mean, in last 100 years, valuation has always been fraught with challenging questions. You have, on the one hand, global estimates, back of the envelope type calculations, and lots of NGOs, advocacy group jump on it. But economists, the development practitioners, have their own view about it. And that's why people say that some of the valuations have been very bad. I mean, they make a sound bite or headlines for a day, for a few weeks, but that's all. Serious decisions, even in the multilateral trust fund like IMF or the World Bank or OECD Secretariat or African Development Bank, we don't have much evidence that those valuations have been taken seriously. Number one, the way those valuations have been done. Secondly, there has been some element of credibility which they lack. Anyway, that is a different story, but that brings the issues of valuation in NBS, and a lot of work has to be done. With that, I would request Emily or Antonio, who is orchestrating the slide, to bring the last slide, to put the last slide. I mean, in any case, I had a few slides, but the last one on the screen, please. No, before this is the slide. Before, yeah. So what we need to do here, this community and the community of practitioners of NBS, we must have a clear definitions, objectives, and a scope of NBS. Many of the NBS have been recommended without much of clarity, conceptual clarity. It serves the purpose. At least you have political buying in. But when you go for the operational things, you need to be more clear and clinical in your approach so that you can be, convincing. Second, we have to curate existing research. There are not many published peer-reviewed pieces on NBS even now. Maybe in this year, I think in last 6 months, there have been a very good progress. There have been few things in Nature or Science or other, but as you know, the economics literature is slightly different from Nature or Science. So validate existing studies that can be used for future work on NBS. Identify common conceptual errors and flag them off upfront. Recommend best practices. That will help. Assess the ability of complex models to make useful predictions at relevance, spatial, and temporal scales. This is very important. What is possible for a site in Indonesia or India or DRC Congo may not be relevant for the entire country or entire sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia or South Asia, respectively. That we have to be clear. Sometimes recommendations, if we are not clear and convincing and credible, forget about it. People will not take it. People, when I talk about people, I'm thinking of the bankers, financial institutions, and politicians. Second final point is identify reflective policy instruments for implementation of NBS. So regulations, taxes, subsidies, changes in land tenure, communal resource management, monitoring and enforcement of conservation measures, and other policy measures. NBS need to be couched in the larger fiscal, monetary, trade, and investment design. You have greater chance to succeed. Somehow that is not happening much on this front. Of course, finally, adaptive management plans. Quickly learn from the past mistakes. Don't repeat the same recommendations that has less chance to succeed. I think these are some of the key questions which I have learned just now from your presentations, but also some of the systematic review of NBS and some of the success stories of NBS in last few years within the UN system, within the countries, within the NGOs, including TNC and IUCN, WRI, many other colleagues who are working very good, and they have come out with fantastic insights. So that I thought I will share with you, but I'm happy to take more questions and comments from you. Shara, I will stop here. So over to you. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Pushpam. Okay, so we have about 4 minutes until we have to close. So first, I just want to take a second and thank the VJEL team, the students, the faculty, the staff that have been involved in organizing this, and absolutely to thank our incredible speakers and experts on this subject. And finally, all of our tech staff that make the virtual nature of this possible. So I just wanted to make sure I do that. And then I wanted to close out because the audience is largely law students or graduate students studying in the law and policy space. And this, what we're talking about here is quite an interdisciplinary approach. Nature-based solutions require an understanding of the science, the economics, the law, and to be able to apply it. So I wanted to know from each of you if you had recommendations for the audience, the next generation of leaders in, likely in conservation and tackling climate change, what skills and what resources you would recommend they really focus on and hone in on if they're interested in this topic. And so if we could just do a round robin, starting with Jennifer and then going in order.
Well, yes, thank you so much for putting this on your agenda today. And I really take Dr. Kumar's comments, to heart. I would say the biggest piece that I see confronting us right now, and I'm speaking, in the context of a COVID, driven economy whose impacts will be with us, over at least the next decade. I would really recommend digging deep in the economics. I think that it's absolutely critical as we are trying to bring what have been externalities internal to business development and economic prosperity, that you really take the time to understand, what it is that's going to make this scale. I think we're suffering from great projects all over the world, but the reason they're not getting picked up is largely the inability to align incentives with our economic development and our environmental preservation and goals. So that would be something that I would say is a number one skill and insights to bring to this work right now.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ronny.
Yeah, one thing prior to becoming an ambassador, I was Seychelles Minister of Environment, and I would tell people in the ministry is protection of nature is not about nature. It's about people. And one of the things people ask, and it runs on what Pushpam was saying and Jennifer just said, one of the questions people ask is, why should I protect it? What do I get out of it? Especially now, like we're protecting 30% of our ocean, you may be displacing fishermen from traditional fishing grounds. So one of the questions we asked ourselves when we said we were protecting 30%, okay, it's been a long discussion, here's 30% protected. Now what? What's the next step? That is not the end in itself. What will our society, where, as I said, high-income country, we cannot get concessional financing. Fortunately, the financing, the innovative financing we put in place for this cannot be diverted by the Minister of Finance to tackle COVID, unless you're using nature-based solutions as one of the things to tackle COVID. So what we did is we couched it in terms that the money cannot be divided by the Ministry of Finance. But on the other hand, and I come into something that Reid said, the government is saying now, I can't afford any money for conservation anymore. We have to address COVID, we have to address unemployment, etc. You have to make do with whatever financing you can get, which is dedicated to whatever you're doing without counting on government funds. So I think this is there's a lot of lip service being paid to NBS. It's the in thing to say nowadays, we're going to protect this. We all know there are a lot of paper parks around the world. And the issue, and it comes a lot to what Pushpam was saying, the issue is how, when you look at the broader picture, how does protection of trees and coral reefs and species actually contribute to making people's lives better at a time when internationally it's getting more complicated and more difficult? Thank you.
Thank you, Ronny. And Reid?
Yeah, this is Ronny, that was a really great way to frame this. From a sort of a lawyer side, I feel like we're often viewed as a transaction cost in making, in the way of getting things done. And I think what's needed to make nature-based solutions work is creative and solutions-oriented lawyers. And that will require, it's sort of, we're building the car as we're driving it. We're going to need corporate lawyers who are able to think about how to structure these. We're going to need public lands lawyers. We're going to need folks in the State Department thinking about nature, NDCs. So we're going to need everyone working together to make this a success. The word solution is easily used, and it's really difficult to resolve anything as a solution. So hopefully we can continue to make progress, but the only way that we're going to do that is by people with a variety of backgrounds working together, and lawyers are a big part of that.
Great, thank you so much, Reid. And Pushpam, you can close us out.
Yep. 3-4 things. First of all, I mean, nature is essential for our survival, number one. I mean, you take the contributions, whether it is $44 trillion coming from biodiversity to the global GDP, or GDP, or G8 plus 5 ministerial meeting saying $125 trillion is the worth of the natures. Obviously, it is much more than the global, GDP, and that means that part of the contribution of nature is unaccounted and unmonetized. So, nature is important. I mean, you don't need dollar and pounds value to say that they are important. And very fact, see what we are doing right now. We are talking to the screen, this pandemic, and we have pumped around $13 trillion as a relief package. Now, this can go on. And this has happened because the way we have used nature and biodiversity. Domestication of the wild, climate change, fragmentation of habitat. So if we don't establish the importance of nature in the legal framework, in economic framework, we don't have any chance for survival. So what I'm expecting from this bright legal experts, they should think of a framework where nature is in the center of the economy. It is not a matter of choice. We have no choice, basically. And please remember, this pandemic may not be the last one. If we don't, we had MERS and SARS and Ebola and Zika and whatnot. Though on those occasions, we were lucky. This time we are not. The world will not be the same again, as it happened in Europe in 13th, 14th century after that plague, and the world changed. This time also the world will change. Now, what framework I'm thinking of? Number one, change the basic compass of the progress. It should not be GDP. Maybe you can think of inclusive wealth, where you have produced human and natural capital, maybe social capital as well. Second, nature must be mainstreamed and integrated in each sphere of economic phenomena, fiscal, monetary policy, investment, trade, debt for nature swap, fantastic example. And for this, legal profession has to be ready. Finally, in our not only the indicators, but also in the banking and financial sectors, I mean, nature has to be brought. How? What could be the pathways? What will be the methodologies? That is where a lot of contribution has to come from the institutional and legal framework. And these people who are in the audience right now, they should think about it. I will stop here. And there is a lot of challenges ahead, of course.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. So thank you to all of the speakers and again to those organizing the symposium. Next up at 3:15 is protecting our grid. There's a panel on protecting our grid. And I think it was really helpful to get your perspectives on the best marching orders and inspiration for the next generation as they dive further into their careers in law and policy. So thank you again for your time today.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.